When I first moved into the neighborhood, it seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. After a rough breakup and the stress of changing jobs, I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere I could breathe. The house was charming, a bit old but with character, and the neighbors seemed friendly enough. It was a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other. But there was one house that stood out, the one right next to mine. The house belonged to Mr. Holloway, an older man who lived alone. He was polite, always nodding when we crossed paths, but there was something off about him. He rarely left his house, and when he did, it was always at odd hours, early in the morning or late at night. His curtains were always drawn, and I never saw any lights on, even after dark. At first, I thought he was just a private person, someone who valued his solitude. But as the days turned into weeks, I started noticing strange things. It began with the noises, soft, almost imperceptible sounds coming from his house at night. It was like a low hum, sometimes a faint scratching, other times what sounded like muffled whispers. I'd lie in bed, straining to hear, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling or the wind outside. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped out into my backyard, hoping to get a better sense of where the noises were coming from. The night was still, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. I crept closer to the fence that separated our properties, listening. The noises were clearer now, definitely coming from Mr. Holloway's house. There was a rhythmic tapping, almost like someone knocking on a door, followed by a dragging sound. My heart pounded as I peered through a gap in the fence. The backyard was dark, but I could make out a faint light coming from his basement window. I hesitated, torn between going back inside and checking it out. But something compelled me to move forward, to find out what was going on. I slipped through the side gate and crept closer to the window. The light was dim, barely illuminating the room, but I could see enough to know that something was very wrong. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and what looked like tools. Large, rusted tools that didn't belong in a normal household. There were chains hanging from the ceiling, and in the center of the room, a large table covered with something. Someone. I gasped and stumbled back, my mind racing. Had I just seen what I thought I saw? I must have made some noise because the light suddenly went out, plunging the basement into darkness. Panic surged through me as I scrambled back to my house, praying he hadn't seen me. That night, I barely slept. My mind was filled with horrific images of what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, in that basement. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it. The next day, I tried to go about my usual routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I passed Mr. Holloway's house, I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. I started avoiding him, taking different routes to my car, and staying inside as much as possible. But the noises continued, growing louder and more frequent. I could hear them even during the day now, muffled thuds, dragging sounds, and once, a scream so faint I wasn't sure if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to call the police. I didn't know what I would tell them, but I knew I had to do something. When the officer arrived, I tried to explain what I'd heard and seen, but I could tell he was skeptical. "Probably just an old man doing some late-night cleaning," he said with a shrug. But when I insisted, he agreed to take a look. I watched from my window as the officer knocked on Mr. Holloway's door. For a moment, there was no answer, and I felt a surge of vindication. But then the door creaked open, and Mr. Holloway appeared, looking as harmless as ever. They spoke for a few minutes, and then the officer nodded and left, giving me a small wave as he walked back to his car. When he returned, he told me that everything seemed fine. Mr. Holloway had explained that he was a retired carpenter and that he sometimes worked on projects in his basement. The officer suggested that I might be hearing normal household noises amplified by the quietness of the neighborhood. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, the noises were louder than ever. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing as I listened to the sounds of chains rattling, something heavy being dragged across the floor, and then silence. I don't know what possessed me, but I decided to go over there. Maybe it was the frustration of not being believed, or maybe it was just sheer terror, but I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to Mr. Holloway's house. The front door was locked, but the side gate was open. I slipped through and crept around to the back. The basement window was dark, but I could still hear faint noises from inside. With shaking hands, I pushed the window open and climbed inside. The basement was cold, the air thick with the smell of metal and something else, something foul. I shone my flashlight around, illuminating the room. The table was there, but whatever or whoever had been on it was gone. The chains hung empty from the ceiling, and the tools lay scattered on the floor. But there was something else, something on the walls. I stepped closer, my flashlight revealing what looked like stains. Dark, rusty stains that trailed down the walls and pooled on the floor. My stomach churned as I realized what they were. Blood. Suddenly, I heard footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. Mr. Holloway was home. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to find a place to hide. I ducked behind a stack of old boxes just as the basement door creaked open. He stood at the top of the stairs, his silhouette outlined in the faint light from the hallway. He didn't say anything, but I could feel his eyes scanning the room. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come down. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and closed the door, leaving me alone in the dark. I waited for what seemed like hours before I dared to move. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. I climbed back out the window and ran home, not stopping until I was safely inside. I locked the doors, pulled the curtains, and called the police again, this time telling them everything. When they arrived, I led them to the basement, but by then, it was too late. The room was empty, no table, no chains, no stains. It was as if nothing had ever happened. They didn't believe me. They thought I was crazy, imagining things, maybe even trying to get back at my neighbor for some imagined slight. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that Mr. Holloway is hiding something dark and terrible. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. But even now, miles away, I can still hear the faint sounds at night, the dragging, the whispers, the screams. And I wonder how many other neighbors have noticed, how many have dared to look. I thought leaving the neighborhood would be the end of it. I thought putting miles between myself and that cursed house would give me peace. But it didn't. The nightmares started the first night in my new apartment. They were vivid, suffocating dreams that left me drenched in sweat, heart pounding as I jolted awake. Every night, I dreamt of Mr. Holloway's basement, the cold, dark room with its rusty chains and blood-stained walls. But the dreams didn't stop there. They grew more twisted, more detailed. I'd find myself standing in that basement, staring at the table in the center of the room. In the dreams, the table was always occupied, sometimes by people I recognized, other times by faceless, shadowy figures. And each time, I could feel Mr. Holloway's presence, lurking just out of sight, watching me with those cold, calculating eyes. I became obsessed. During the day, I tried to go about my life, pretending that everything was fine. But at night, the dreams dragged me back to that basement, forcing me to relive the horror over and over again. I started researching, trying to find out more about Mr. Holloway and his past. But there was nothing, no records, no old news articles, nothing to suggest that he even existed before moving into that house. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. Then, one day, I received a letter. It was postmarked from my old neighborhood, and the handwriting on the envelope was neat, almost meticulous. I hesitated before opening it, my hands trembling. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message scrawled in black ink. "You shouldn't have left." My blood ran cold. The letter wasn't signed, but I knew who it was from. I could almost hear his voice in my head, whispering those words, taunting me. The fear that had been simmering inside me for weeks exploded into full-blown panic. I checked the locks on my doors and windows, paranoid that he would find me. Every creak and groan of the old apartment sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I couldn't sleep. I could barely eat. I was consumed by the fear that Mr. Holloway was coming for me. Desperation led me to reach out to the only person who might understand, Mrs. Holloway. I didn't know much about her, only that she had left Mr. Holloway years ago. I managed to track her down through a friend of a friend, and when I finally found her, I was surprised by how ordinary she seemed. An unassuming woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a warm smile. She agreed to meet me at a small cafe, and as we sat down, I could see the concern in her eyes as she listened to my story. When I finished, she sighed and took a long sip of her tea before speaking. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "There have been others, all with the same story. They hear things, see things, and eventually they leave just like you did. But the fear never goes away." I leaned forward, my heart racing. "What is he? What's he doing in that house?" Mrs. Holloway hesitated, her eyes flickering with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or something darker. "I don't know," she admitted. "And I don't want to know. All I can tell you is that he wasn't always like this. When we first married, he was a kind man, a loving husband. But something changed. He became obsessed with that house, with what was underneath it." "Underneath it?" I repeated, confused. She nodded, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The house is built on old land. Land that has a history, a dark history. He found something down there, something he shouldn't have. It's changed him, turned him into whatever he is now." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "What did he find?" "I don't know," she said again, her voice trembling. "I left before I could find out. But whatever it is, it's evil and it's taken hold of him. You need to stay away from that house, from him. He's dangerous." I left the cafe with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. I wasn't safe. I knew I couldn't keep living in fear, waiting for Mr. Holloway to find me. I had to do something, but I didn't know what. The police hadn't believed me before, and I doubted they would now, especially with no evidence. Then, one night, the decision was made for me. It was late, past midnight, when I was jolted awake by a loud banging on my door. My heart leaped into my throat as I sat up, straining to listen. The banging came again, more insistent this time. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but then I heard a voice, a familiar voice. "Let me in," Mr. Holloway called from the other side of the door. "We need to talk." Terror gripped me as I stared at the door, frozen in place. How had he found me? I hadn't told anyone where I was living, hadn't contacted anyone from the old neighborhood. The banging grew louder, more frantic. "You can't hide from me," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "I know you've been talking to her. You've seen things you shouldn't have, but it's not too late. Open the door and we can make this right." I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. I knew I couldn't face him, not alone. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address to the operator. But as I waited for the police to arrive, the banging stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, I heard a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My blood ran cold as I realized it was coming from inside the apartment. I turned, my flashlight casting long shadows across the walls, and there he was. Mr. Holloway stood in the corner of my living room, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. His face was twisted into a grotesque smile, and in his hand he held something long and sharp. "I told you," he said, his voice soft and chilling. "You shouldn't have left." I screamed and ran for the door, fumbling with the lock, but it was too late. He was on me in an instant, his hand clamping over my mouth, silencing my screams. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was his voice, whispering in my ear, "It's time to finish what we started." When I woke up, I was back in the basement. My hands and feet were bound, and the cold metal of the table pressed against my back. I struggled, but the ropes were too tight. Panic surged through me as I looked around, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was just as I remembered it. Rusted chains, blood-stained walls, and that awful, suffocating smell. Mr. Holloway stood over me, his expression calm, almost serene. "You shouldn't have left," he repeated, as if that explained everything. "You saw too much, But it's not too late to make this right. He raised the knife, the blade catching the light as he brought it closer to my throat. My heart pounded, and I thrashed against the ropes, but it was no use. I knew what was coming, knew there was no escape. But just as the blade touched my skin, there was a loud crash, and the door to the basement flew open. The police stormed in, guns drawn, shouting commands. Mr. Holloway hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the door, and in that moment, I saw my chance. I kicked out with all my strength, knocking the knife from his hand. It clattered to the floor, and the police were on him in an instant, pulling him away from me. I collapsed back onto the table, gasping for breath, my body trembling with shock and relief. The officers untied me and led me out of the basement, but as I stumbled up the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that somehow Mr. Holloway would find a way to come after me again. In the days that followed, the police searched the house, but they found nothing. No evidence of the horrors I had witnessed, no trace of the people who had disappeared. It was as if the house itself had swallowed everything, erasing all traces of what had happened. Mr. Holloway was taken into custody, but he refused to speak, even as the authorities tried to piece together what he had done. The case was eventually closed, labeled as a domestic disturbance, with insufficient evidence to pursue further charges. I moved again, this time far away, to a place where I hoped he would never find me. But the nightmares continue, and every time I close my eyes, I see his face, hear his voice whispering in the dark. And I know, deep down, that it's not over. He's still out there, waiting, watching, biding his time. Because no matter how far I run, no matter how well I hide, the secrets of that house will never let me go.